You're listening to the Converging Paths podcast, brought to you by Barakat Trust, with the support of the Al-Tajir Trust and the Aga Khan Trust for Culture.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Barakat Trust podcast. I'm Hugo Cook, and with us today, we are very fortunate to have Dr. Jane Kershaw, who is the Associate Professor of Viking Age Archaeology at Oxford University. Now, obviously, for a podcast often dedicated to Islamic art and heritage, people might be wondering why Viking Age archaeology. But Jane is going to tell us some very interesting things today about the links between these two worlds that are often considered separate, which isn't always, according to the archaeological evidence, the case. Thanks for joining us, Jane.
Thanks so much for having me.
Great. And so first off, I suppose I'll just ask you, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what sort of thing you've worked on?
Yeah, so I'm a fairly recently appointed Gad Rausing Associate Professor in Viking Age Archaeology at Oxford. So I'm an historian and archaeologist by background, and I work on the archaeology of the Scandinavian world. I'm especially interested in links between the Viking Age Scandinavian world and their Eastern trade links, which extend to the Islamic Caliphate.
Brilliant, thank you. So today we're going to be talking a bit about the Bedale Hoard and your work there. What is this hoard? What was it used for in general? And why do you think the site is significant overall?
Yeah, the Bedale Hoard is a fairly recent discovery. It was found by two metal detectorists in 2012, and it's a collection of 37 silver objects, mostly rings and ingots that are sort of typical Scandinavian forms, as well as a gold Anglo-Saxon sword pommel. It's a large amount of wealth. Altogether, the silver objects weigh around 4 kilograms, so it's a lot of precious metal. And it's deposited in what today is a very typical English country town. Bedale is northwest of York, around 30 miles or so northwest of York, quite far from the English coastline. And yet we have this deposit of Viking Age silver objects. And when we analysed the silver for lead isotopes and trace elements, we could see that a large component of it was actually made from Islamic silver.
That's really interesting. So what were some of the really exciting finds for you there? And they don't just have to be the Islamic finds. And what made them exciting?
Yeah, so and part of the hoard is sort of a typical item. So ingots, these are like cigar-shaped ingots. They're a way of storing metal and they're pretty standardized. That's the point. But the hoard also contains an absolutely enormous neck collar formed by multiple plates of twisted silver rods. And this is an enormous item of jewelry that's meant to be worn and displayed. So it's a real show of wealth, and the form is completely unparalleled. And to have Anglo-Saxon gold in a Viking Age silver hoard is incredibly unusual as well. And we know from the decoration of the golds on this sword that it's a local Anglo-Saxon manufacture. And so clearly this is something that is being acquired locally. And because it's got a military nature, they belong to a sword fitting, it suggests some sort of violence or coercion behind its acquisition.
Wow, so we've got a real mix of cultures going on here. And this idea of the acquisition that you mentioned, how these things are getting acquired. What sort of Islamic material is in the hoard and how was it acquired? How did it get here? Because there's an association today with the Vikings as pillagers and looters, and that one might imagine the things they acquired were primarily from looting, but how might this sort of counter that narrative?
Yeah, so if you just looked at all the objects, you wouldn't notice that there was anything Islamic about them. So all the objects of a Scandinavian cultural form would have been manufactured in Scandinavia or areas where the Scandinavians settled. It was only by doing the analysis of the metals that we could tell that the origins of the silver, in fact, lay in the Islamic lands. And specifically, the origin is dirhams. So Islamic silver coins, very high quality silver coins that are produced by the Umayyads and Abbasids and form part of a northern trade network with the Baltic and Scandinavian areas. Now, we do know about these finds from Scandinavia. In the 10th century, there are thousands, indeed hundreds of thousands of dirhams found in Scandinavia. It's actually the most common single type of Viking Age artifact is the Islamic dirham, which is kind of amazing. But this hoard from Bedale is much earlier. It was probably deposited around 900. And we're far away from the Baltic. You know, we're in deepest Yorkshire here. So when we were quite surprised to find this strong Islamic component quite early on and so far west. But it was clear from the isotopes that it was a very good match for the sorts of dirhams that are arriving in Scandinavia between about 800 and 850.
So that's incredibly interesting that the most common single type of artifact from this era and area is Islamic dirhams. Why are they appearing up here around the Baltic and in Northern Europe? Are they being used as currency in this area, or are they sort of foreign curios, or are they silver bullion? What's going on there?
Yes, I think they probably, the perception of dirhams and their use changes over time. So to begin with, we have a sort of small inflow of dirhams from around 800. And yeah, then they're more sort of curiosity, sort of exotic items. They can be pierced and worn as necklaces, so they're incorporated into women's dress. Over time, they start to be hoarded, and it seems that their value turns into one of being a store of high quality silver, which is very useful for the Viking Age Scandinavians because they operate a bullion economy based on the weight and the purity of metal. So rather than having their own coinage, they'll exchange silver by weight. And they test the quality of that silver because the purity is a really important component of that. Islamic dirhams, being high quality silver, often sort of 97, 98% silver, are a good, trustworthy source of fine silver. So they begin to be accumulated and hoarded, deposited in the ground by the Scandinavians, and the numbers keep increasing. The dirhams can also be melted down and cast into artifact types that are culturally meaningful for the Scandinavians. They can be a store of wealth in the form of ingots. They can also be cast into neck rings and arm rings, which can be worn in displays of wealth. And that's the case for the artifacts in the Bedale hoard. The dirhams have been melted down and cast into Scandinavian type of objects. But all of the silver arrives in Scandinavia on the back of a very extensive river-based trade with Islamic merchants. You have Scandinavians leaving mostly eastern Scandinavia, heading into northern parts of Russia, and progressing down Russian rivers, meeting Islamic merchants traveling up from the Islamic lands and meeting in sort of midway places. What are they trading in return for dirhams? It's a big question, but no doubt furs from the forests of northern Scandinavia and Russia, and also slaves, enslaved people, are a big part of this trade system.
That's really interesting because that idea of the Islamic merchants having a big influence on why these things end up there. Does that mean that beyond these items and these Islamic materials or materials coming from the Islamic world, do we see a great deal of other cultural influences from other parts of the world, other materials like this that are collected or coins from other cultures that are brought in as bullion? Or is the Islamic world somewhat remarkable in Viking Age Scandinavia in that sense? What sort of cultural influences do we see from around the place at play here?
Yeah, so absolutely other areas also influence Scandinavia in this time and particularly on silver. So Western European countries at this time, England, the Carolingian continent, will have already produced their own coinage way in advance of the Scandinavians. And the initial Scandinavian coinages model the iconography based on those examples from further south and Western Europe. So that is another alternative source. But certainly for the Baltic area and Eastern Scandinavia, the sheer number of dirhams just far outweighs anything else that's coming in. So it seems to be an incredibly fruitful source of wealth, and it must have involved decent amount of the population being engaged in the system one way or another.
That's so interesting, and I'm dying to know what sort of person might have acquired things like dirhams, used them, and used items like those found in the Bedale hoard.
Yeah, maybe not a very nice one would be my thought. Like this is a trade in one sense, in that it's an exchange of goods for another, but a lot of it is likely to be based on the slave trade, and that, of course, is not a proper trade as we would see it today. It's based on coercion and human suffering. So I think the currents underlying this are pretty grim in terms of human history and what it would have meant for the fate of the people that are being traded. We have some very graphic accounts by Islamic writers from this period who observed these Scandinavian merchants known as Rus in their trading activities. And they comment on, yes, there are furs being exchanged, and these are obtained in the various forest regions. But there are also slaves, and these slaves are sometimes being quite maltreated. So we do get that aspect of human suffering as well. That's not to say necessarily that the person who buried the Bedale hoard was themselves a slave trader. I think in terms of the dynamics of this trade, I see it as people working particular branches of a route. So you might have a route that spans a certain part of a river system, and then you hand your cargo on to the next trader who does the next route, and then it goes on from there. So it's not the case that people from Scandinavia regularly actually reach the Islamic lands, or even go to Baghdad. I mean, I think that's those people will be very, very few in number, but there is nonetheless an exposure to some parts of the Islamic world through the coinage.
And that idea of a sort of indirect connection, not necessarily going to Baghdad. Did Viking Age people in Scandinavia would they have known well where this material was from, what these coins geographically represented? Would they often have sort of collected it just from a trader and they might have thought, oh, it came from these foreign forest regions of Northern Europe? Or did they sort of know exactly what they were dealing with here?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's a really interesting question. I mean, they do know that there is a distant and wealthy place, which they actually call Cirkland, which might mean the land of the Saracens. That's the sort of origin of the word. So they do have that knowledge, and this name appears on rune stones. So commemorative stones set up to remember people who have died on expeditions to that place. So it will say something like Toki and Gunnar died in the east in Cirkland. So there is a knowledge of the name, at least. There is also a later saga that talks about the travels of somebody called Ingvar, who travels to the Caspian Sea area and has a disastrous voyage. And we know separately that Ingvar's voyage is commemorated on a lot of these rune stones, with this name, Cirkland. So I think people would have understood it as somewhere that is distant, that is dangerous, but it has a sort of potency, this Cirkland. But it's also clear they don't have any actual knowledge of it. So the geography of this region in Ingvar's saga is completely garbled. It's full of sort of mythical creatures, and there's no real sense that there's an understanding of the true geography of the place. The dirhams themselves are interesting because sometimes they have graffiti written on them, and sometimes the Arabic text, which you find on dirhams, has been pecked or marked out somehow, which has led to the suggestion that people understand this is text from another area with a distinct religion, and somehow by trying to obliterate those markings on the coin, you're somehow obliterating that religion, which I'm not sure I completely agree with. But there are cases where you have a Thor's hammer, a symbol of pagan paganism marked on dirhams as well. So perhaps there is some understanding of not just this comes from another place, but there's another religion in this other place that is somehow represented on the coin.
That's fascinating. What do we have any sort of idea of what perceptions might have existed in Viking Age Europe from any direct contacts that there were, some of the ones you mentioned with the Islamic world, and which parts of the Islamic world were they interacting with when it was direct?
There's another way in which they interact with the Islamic world, and that is through Spain, because Viking groups raid Spain in the 9th century, and they attack Seville, and they seem to be aiming for Cordoba, but they don't get there. And after leaving Seville, they raid Nekor in modern day Morocco, and they're said to burn mosques on the southern tip of the Iberian Peninsula. So there's raiding activity that would actually have brought them into direct contact with Muslim communities. So that's another strand. But those accounts that we have don't really tell us anything about what the Vikings thought about those interactions. Their actions in those areas are very much like raiding anywhere else. You know, they're sacking towns, they're taking people captive, they're trying to ransom people in return for movable wealth. So there's no sense of treating these places as anywhere different.
That's brilliant, Jane. Thank you. So, how unusual is it to find material from the Islamic world in a medieval Northern European hoard like this? Is there anything else significant in the region in terms of archaeological finds that's worth discussing?
Yeah, so we have a few examples. You know, people go metal detecting, they find single finds of dirhams. There are occasional finds. There's a sort of modest number, but I don't think we were expecting quite this large amount of dirham silver to be represented in a hoard that is so far west. We normally think that the Vikings are pillaging places and taking wealth out of their communities. But the Bedale hoard shows that they're also bringing silver with them when they leave Scandinavia and come to England and go raiding. You know, they're bringing that wealth along with them. So that's a sort of quite a different angle on how we normally think of the Vikings. In terms of Bedale itself, it's an interesting time period for this region of Northumbria, because the Vikings have taken control of York in around 866. It's a very tumultuous period. We don't know a lot about the Viking kings who are ruling York at this time, but it does seem to be mostly in Scandinavian hands. But they're having to fight the English often for control of the area. There's Viking groups in York as well as Dublin. So there's toing and froing between those two centres. You can well imagine that there's a lot of political instability that means a large amount of wealth like the Bedale hoard has to be buried for safekeeping. We know that the hoard was wrapped in textile, at least the sword was, because we found the remains of textiles on it. And it was then placed in a box because we have the remains of wood also attached to that sword pommel. And so it was sort of deliberately buried underneath a large stone. There's no indication of settlement in the area, so it seems to have been buried just in an open field. But no doubt there was some marker on top of it, which meant that its owner could come back and retrieve it at some point. But of course, they never did.
Which is good for the archaeologists, I guess.
It's great,
yeah. Great. Jane, that was so interesting. I think people have probably learned quite a lot about this bizarre and incredibly broad network that stretched all the way out from West Asia into and the Western Mediterranean, all the way up into Northern Europe and around the Baltic. Where, if people want to go and see the Bedale hoard, can they go and find it?
Yes, you must go and see it. To see these incredible silver objects. They're really well preserved, and you can go and see this massive neck collar. It's on display at Yorkshire Museum, and right now it's part of the Viking North exhibition held at Yorkshire Museum right in the centre of York, so do go and see it.
What sort of thing are you planning to work on next, and where can people see your work in future?
Yes, that's a good question. Well, at the moment, I'm working on a mapping project because I think one of the fantastic things about the Vikings is that they they meet a large range of people in many parts of the globe. And so sort of tracking those interactions through maps in a very visual way is something I'm quite keen to do. And we're keen to continue our metal analysis as well, looking at ways people are exploiting natural resources, looking at the movement of wealth and how that circulates within these Viking Age economies are all themes that I'm interested in.
Well, that all sounds fascinating, that mapping, sort of seeing the breadth of everything. And I'm sure everyone will be excited to follow along with that and stay updated. Jane, thank you so much for speaking to us today. And we look forward to hopefully seeing you in the future. Have a lovely day. Thanks, Jane.
Thanks so much.